The sky hung low and grey over the small riverside village, a heavy stillness clinging to the morning air. Rain threatened from the clouds above, the kind of thick, angry clouds that seemed to echo the turmoil inside Rita's chest. She stood at the water's edge, trembling, soaked through, barefoot on the muddy bank. Her wrapper, worn thin in places, clung to her as the early breeze whipped around her body. She stared into the river, unblinking, as if waiting for something to rise from its depths or to drag her under. Behind her, the village stirred faintly, the crack of a rooster's call, the distant clatter of metal pots, and the hum of voices just beginning to rise with the light. But Rita heard none of it. Her eyes remained fixed on the current, which lapped quietly against the banks, indifferent to memory, to grief dot in her mind. It all came back fast, brutal flashes, a baby's scream roar, new helpless, a woman's voice, sharp and cold, spitting venom. Asterisk, you should never have been born. Asterisk, then a splash, then nothing, just silence. Thick, ringing silence. Rita's breath hitched. Her knees buckled. She sank into the wet earth, hands pressed into the mud, and screamed into the wind a scream torn from the depths of her body. Loud and hoarse and full of everything she'd never been allowed to say. The river didn't answer. Her voice cracked through the air. But the village behind her remained quiet, as if it hadn't heard, as if it never had. Then quietly, her voice calmer now, older cut in low and sure, like something grown strong from surviving. My stepmother said no one would believe me, but one day they all did. And for the first time in years, that truth spoken aloud didn't echo back empty. It hung there, a beginning dot. Rita was born into a world that once felt warm and full of promise. Her earliest memories were of her father, Papa Ejike, a broad-shouldered man whose laugh could fill a room and whose hands always smelled faintly of palm oil. He was a respected trader in their riverside village, a man whose word carried weight at village meetings and whose generosity kept neighbors fed in lean times. Her mother died bringing her into the world, a loss that cast a quiet shadow over Rita's childhood but never dimmed the love her father showed her. He called her my miracle, wrapped her tightly in his arms each night, and braided her hair with his own large, calloused fingers when no one else could. For 9 years, she was his only child, his light, his little shadow trailing after him on muddy roads and into market stalls. But everything shifted when Kuma arrived. Young, beautiful, and soft-spoken in public, Kuma was nothing like the women from the village. She had city-polished, her nails were always done, her slippers always clean. At first, Rita tried to win her over, smiling eagerly, offering to help with chores, fetching water without being asked. But Kioma's kindness was always just out of reach, hidden behind a thin veil of civility that disappeared the moment Papa wasn't looking. Rita quickly learned to read between the lines of Kioma's sugary voice. The scoldings came in whispers, the punishments wrapped in the threat of silence. "Stop being so needy," Kioma would hiss. "Do you want your father to regret keeping you?" As the years passed, Kioma had 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl, now 5 and 7. Papa Ejike began to slow down, his hair grayed. His movements lost their confident rhythm, and his once sharp eyes dimmed with the haze of diabetes and age. Rita had long since grown into a woman by then, strong and capable, with nimble fingers that could coax patterns from plain cloth. She fell in love with a quiet mechanic named Chuka and married him against Kioma's thin-lipped protests. For a brief time, Rita knew joy again, but fate was cruel. Chuka died without warning, a sudden fever that didn't wait for answers. Alone and grieving with an infant son, Kamsi, in her arms, Rita returned to the only place she could, her father's house, but it was no longer truly her home. Kioma ruled it now. She managed Papa's medication, oversaw the household accounts, and ensured her own children had everything they needed. To Rita, she offered barely more than tolerance. The welcome was lukewarm, always edged with an undercurrent of disdain. Kamsi, too young to understand, was treated like a burden, an unwanted reminder of a man Kioma had never approved of. "He cries too much," Kioma would mutter. "He eats like a grown man." Her children, mimicking their mother, began to shove and tease him, while Kioma turned a blind eye. Rita kept her head down. She stitched clothes late into the night, her needle dancing through fabric by candlelight. Her small seamstress business brought in modest money, barely enough for soap and baby formula, but Kioma often questioned even that. "You work all day, but there's nothing to show," she'd say, within earshot of Papa. "She thinks because she's the first child, everything belongs to her." Papa Ejike, once a lion of a man, now nodded along, confused and weary. His memory flickered on and off. Sometimes he reached for Rita's hand, calling her his miracle once more. Other times, he asked her why she didn't do more to help around the house, his thoughts shaped by Kioma's constant whispers. Rita swallowed the bitterness. She still bathed him when the house was quiet. She still mixed his morning pap, adjusted his insulin doses, even though Kioma claimed full responsibility. Every day, Rita told herself to hold on for her son, who needed safety, and for her father, whose soul still lived somewhere inside that fragile body. There were moments when Rita considered leaving. She imagined a tiny rented room somewhere, just enough for her and Kamsi, somewhere far from Kioma's shadow. But every time she thought about it, the faces of her father and son overlapped in her mind. She couldn't abandon him, not while he was still alive, still breathing. And so she stayed. She stitched, endured, smiled when expected, and watched. Something was not right, she could feel it. Kioma's grip on the household was too tight, her secrets wrapped too carefully. But Rita had learned patience from years of silence, and if the past had taught her anything, it was this: truth always rises. Eventually, the morning broke too quietly. The rooster crowed as usual, but something in the air felt wrong, too still, too sharp. Rita sat up on her mat and immediately sensed the absence. The space beside her, where Kamsi usually curled up with his soft baby breaths and warm little limbs, was empty. The mat was cool to the touch. Her heart lurched. She reached out again, frantic, as if somehow she had missed him in the folds of the thin wrapper she used as a cover. "Kamsi," she called, her voice rising, cracking. "Number." Reply. She sprang to her feet, eyes darting across the small room. His shoes were still by the door. His cup sat untouched on the stool. Panic gripped her throat as she tore out into the compound, calling his name. "Kamsi, Kamsi." Her voice echoed across the yard, bouncing off walls that offered no answers. She checked the kitchen, the storeroom, behind the water drums, beneath the bed in Papa's room. Nothing. Her breathing grew shallow. Sweat mixed with the early morning dew on her skin. Her wrapper slipped from one shoulder as she ran barefoot to the neighbors, banging on doors, pleading, "Have you seen my son? He's gone." Nobody had seen a thing. People exchanged wary glances, murmured confusion, shook their heads. She turned and found Kioma standing in the doorway of the main house, arms folded neatly, her expression unreadable. No urgency, no concern, just cold distance. Then she said, flatly, dry-eyed, "Check the river. Maybe the spirits took him, like they took your mother." The words hit Rita like a slap. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She tore down the path toward the river, screaming his name, stumbling over roots and rocks. The mud sucked at her feet, thorns scratched her arms, but she didn't stop. The water shimmered in the early light, calm and uncaring. She searched along the banks, scanning the reeds, the rocks, the slow swirl of the current, and then she saw it. Kamsi's blanket, the faded yellow one with the blue edges, caught in the reeds, soaked and tangled, but no sign of her son. Rita fell to her knees, the scream ripping out of her chest and tearing through the still morning air. She clawed at the earth, rocked back and forth, her eyes wide, wild. Time lost all shape. When she finally staggered back to the house, clutching the wet blanket like it could somehow anchor her, Kioma was calmly spooning pap into her children's mouths. They giggled, they ate. Life, for them, went on. Papa Iajike lay asleep on the veranda, his breath shallow, unaware of the storm that had shattered his daughter's world. Rita didn't wait. She marched to the compound of the village chief, her voice hoarse from crying, her arms trembling as she held out the blanket. She took him, she whispered, "Kioma, my son is gone." But Kioma arrived shortly after, eyes now filled with carefully timed tears, her voice tremulous and sorrowful. "She's not well," she told them. "Ever since her husband died, she's been different. Last night, the baby had a fever. He died in her arms. She refused to let go. At dawn, she ran out screaming and threw the blanket in the river. Ask anyone. She's grieving. She's not herself." The villagers hesitated. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a cry, a door creak, a splash in the night. The chief looked at Rita with sorrow, but also suspicion. Whispers bloomed like fungus in the shadows. "Poor girl," they said. She snapped. "Grief does strange things. Madness runs in some bloodlines." Rita stopped eating. She stopped speaking. Days passed in a blur. The sun rose and set without meaning. She sat in silence, rocking gently, the blanket always clutched in her hands. The house moved on around her. Kioma's children laughed. Papa dozed and Kioma smiled, humming as she stirred pots and swept the floor. But beneath the silence, something hardened in Rita, something sharp and watchful. She began to notice things: Kioma's patterns, her movements, the way she whispered to neighbors just out of earshot, the way Papa's insulin bottles sometimes went missing and reappeared with different levels. Rita didn't say a word. She didn't argue, but she watched. Every day, her silence deepened, and so did her resolve. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and she would find the truth, because Kamsi was not just gone, he had been taken, and she would not rest until someone paid for it. The days after Kamsi's disappearance passed like a slow-burning fever sound, feverish and full of invisible wounds. Rita moved through the compound like a ghost, unacknowledged, shadowed by disbelief and suspicion. The whispers in the village had grown sharper, more pointed. Asterisk, she's not right in the head. Maybe she drowned the child herself. Asterisk, she heard it all, every word, and still she said nothing. But inside her, something had changed. What had once been grief was hardening into a quiet fury, a flame that refused to die no matter how much the world tried to smother it. She began watching Kioma more closely, her movements, her visitors, her tone when she thought no one was listening. Rita had inherited an old button recorder from Chuka before he died, something he used when taking inventory at his mechanic shop. She found it buried in a small tin among his belongings and began using it, hiding it behind a woven basket near the front door, sometimes under the bench where Kioma sat with her friends. Most of the conversations were mundane, gossip, the price of gari, whose husband was secretly drinking. But one afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the compound and Kioma laughed with her friend Nena, Rita heard what she had been waiting for. "She's finally quiet," Kioma said, sipping palm wine. "Let her grieve. At least now I don't have to feed another mouth that's not mine." The words were cruel and casual, tossed out without thought, but they sent a jolt through Rita's chest. She played the recording again and again, each time feeling the sting less like pain and more like confirmation. She wasn't crazy. Kioma knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to be indifferent to a baby's disappearance, enough to enjoy his absence. With the recorder tucked safely in her wrapper, Rita decided to try once more to reach her father. That evening, she sat beside him on the veranda, gently taking his hand. His skin was thinner now, the veins showing through like blue threads. His eyes, once so clear and kind, were cloudy with confusion. "Papa," she whispered, "do you believe I would hurt my son?" He looked at her a long time before answering. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, but you are tired, my child. You need to rest. Your stepmother would never hurt a child. She took care of you, didn't she?" His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if he could hear the doubt in his own words, but couldn't bear to confront it. Rita turned away so he wouldn't see the tears. She knew now he could not protect her. Not anymore. Whatever strength he once had was gone, eaten away by sickness, by time, and by Kioma's poison. Then came Ifini. She hadn't seen him in years since childhood, when they used to chase fireflies along the riverbank. He was back in the village now, working with a non-profit that documented abuse and supported women in crisis. When he heard the whispers about her, he came looking. She was in the back of the compound, stitching a torn school uniform when he approached. "Rita," he said, kneeling beside her, "what happened to Kamsi?" The question cracked something open. She hadn't heard her son's name spoken with genuine care in weeks. They talked long into the evening. She played the recording. He listened carefully, his face grim. "This isn't just grief," he said. "This is a crime. And if the police won't help, we gather evidence. We build a case." For the first time since Kamsi vanished, Rita felt a flicker of hope. With Ifenji's help, she began documenting more, taking pictures of household records, noting times, collecting discarded insulin vials Kioma had tampered with. They talked strategy, quietly and in code. Every scrap of proof became a weapon. But Kioma sensed the shift. She began pushing harder. One morning, she banged on Rita's door with a forged eviction notice in hand, claiming Papa no longer wanted her in the house. When Rita refused to leave, Kioma marched to the village square, spinning her web further. "She's unstable," she told anyone who would listen. "Refuses to bathe. Talks to herself. I fear she may harm herself, or someone else." Rita endured it all, even when the priest at the church pulled her aside with pity in his eyes. "Your stepmother, said you, may be troubled," he said gently. "Perhaps this is the same curse that took your mother so young." Each new humiliation stung, but instead of breaking her, they steeled her resolve. The pity, the lies, The rumors, none of it compared to the ache in her chest for her son. Every insult was a nail in the coffin of who she used to be. The meek daughter, the silent wife, the grieving woman. That Rita was gone. In her place stood someone fiercer, someone watching, listening, learning. She moved through the compound with quiet intensity, noticing every interaction, every locked drawer, every raised eyebrow. She kept her rage buried beneath calm, her pain hidden behind a fixed smile. If no one would believe her, then she would gather the truth piece by piece. If the system failed her, she would build her own justice. Kamsi's face lived in her dreams. His laugh echoed in the folds of fabric as she worked, his warmth lingering in the clothes he left behind. She would not let him disappear into silence. She would not let the world move on as if he had never existed. Rita was done begging for belief. She would make them see. The courtroom was stifling, thick with the heat of too many bodies and the weight of truth long buried. Rita sat quietly in her seat, her wrapper carefully tied, her hands folded in her lap, though her fingers trembled slightly with every breath. Beside her, Ifani watched the proceedings with a fixed gaze, the legal aid lawyer flipping through documents, highlighting passages that had become Rita's arsenal. Across the room, Kioma sat with a haughty calm, her headscarf pristine, her face arranged in a mask of concern and self-righteousness. But beneath the surface, her eyes flickered with unease. The case had taken months to build, months of whispered conversations, sleepless nights, and desperate prayers. But Rita had come prepared. The audio recordings were played aloud in the courtroom, each word slicing through the murmuring crowd like a blade. Kioma's mocking voice rang out. Asterisk, let her grieve. At least now I don't have to feed another mouth that's not mine. The courtroom stirred. There was no grief in that tone, no innocence, just callousness. Then came the neighbor's testimony, a woman who lived in the compound just across the narrow footpath. She testified to seeing Kioma slipping out of the house before sunrise, the morning Kamsi disappeared, holding something bundled tightly in a cloth. She said she was going to fetch firewood, the woman said nervously, but there was no firewood when she came back. And finally, the most damning evidence of all, the medical records and photographs showing how Papa Ejik's insulin levels had been dangerously manipulated. With help from a sympathetic nurse and a Feni's NGO, Rita had compiled proof that Kioma had been diluting or skipping doses, keeping the old man weak, foggy, dependent. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The once intouchable Kioma was unraveling before their eyes. But it was what happened just before the final hearing that changed everything. A fisherman, casting his net along a quieter bend of the riverbank, found something tangled in the weeds, something small, wrapped in damp fabric. He alerted the authorities immediately. The coroner's report came swiftly and quietly. The remains matched Kamsi's estimated age and weight. The blanket was the same blue-edged one Rita had clutched for weeks. The cause of death, asphyxiation, time of death, consistent with the morning he vanished. It was a confirmation that shattered any lingering hope, but also sealed the truth beyond doubt. When the news broke, the courtroom became electric with grief and fury. On the day of the final ruling, police arrived at the courthouse steps with a warrant for Kioma's arrest. As the judge prepared to speak, Kioma tried to rise, her face pale, her movements jerky. She didn't make it out the door. You may, the officer said clearly. You are under arrest for the murder of Kamsi Yume and the attempted poisoning of Ejik Yume. The crowd gasped. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Kioma broke, then her composure shattering like thin glass. She screamed, clawing at her headscarf, her voice raw and frantic. I did it for my children. He was a burden. He wasn't even her husband's child. The courtroom erupted in stunned cries, the shock rippling through every bench. Rita froze, her breath caught somewhere between pain and disbelief. The weight of that final betrayal settled over her like a heavy fog. Behind her, Papa Ijike, who had been brought to witness the verdict in his wheelchair, let out a soft, broken sob. His head dropped to his chest as he murmured, "What have I allowed in my home?" He wept openly, his shoulders shaking under the gravity of it all. The man who had once been her protector now sat crumbling, realizing too late that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had given power over his household, had poisoned not just his body but his legacy. As Kioma was dragged away, cursing and wailing, Rita remained still. There was no triumph in her eyes, only exhaustion, grief, vindication laced with sorrow. Her baby was truly gone. Nothing could return Kamsi to her arms. But the lie that had stolen him was finally exposed. Outside, the villagers gathered in hushed groups, watching as the woman they had once believed, once feared, was taken away in handcuffs. Some turned to look at Rita, shame etched in their expressions. No one said a word to her, but their silence was heavy with apology. Rita didn't need their words. She had walked through fire. She had stood alone. And now, as the sun pierced through the clouds, burning away the morning mist, she stood with her head high, mourning her son but no longer unseen. The gavel came down with finality. Kioma was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom had been packed for the verdict, but the silence that followed the judge's words was louder than any uproar. Kioma didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared ahead, expression vacant, as though the weight of her own cruelty had finally caught up with her. Her children, now orphans of circumstance, were placed into protective custody by the state, away from the legacy of lies and bitterness they had unknowingly inherited. Rita watched them go with a heavy heart. They were not to blame. They, too, were victims of a woman who had turned motherhood into a weapon. In the quiet weeks that followed, the compound felt different, quieter, lighter. Papa Ejik's health deteriorated steadily, though Rita stayed by his side, tending to him with a calm that came not from forgiveness but from duty, and perhaps a final love. One evening, as the sun cast long golden shadows over the veranda, he took her hand in his and whispered, "I failed you. I let a serpent into our home." With trembling hands, he gave her a signed deed. The house was now hers. It was his final attempt to make amends before he passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months later. His funeral was simple but dignified, and for the first time in years, Rita felt the weight of the past slowly begin to shift off her shoulders. With the compound hers, Rita began to dream again, not for herself, but for women like her. Using a modest grant secured with Afenia's help and some of her late husband's savings, she turned 2 of the back rooms into a safe space for women fleeing abuse. It started with one, a girl barely 20, pregnant and kicked out by her family. Then came another, her face bruised, her eyes empty. Word spread quietly but steadily. Soon the shelter had a name, Kamsi's Haven, named not in sorrow, but in honor, a place where broken women could rest, where grief didn't mean madness and silence wasn't mistaken for weakness. The villagers who once whispered behind her back now came to her with soft apologies, small offerings of food, bolts of cloth, and, slowly, respect. They saw how she moved with quiet strength, how she listened without judgment, how she gave voice to the voiceless. They no longer called her the widow, the mad one, or asterisk the cursed child. They called her Auntie Rita asterisk, Mama Haven. Some even simply said, "That woman saved me." Each morning, Rita would open the windows of the shelter and let the light in. She kept a small framed photo of Kamsi on her desk, his only portrait, taken when he was 6 months old, gummy smile. And all, she didn't cry as often anymore, but when she did, she let the tears come without shame. Grief would never leave her completely, but it had transformed no longer a weight, but a quiet guide. And when the wind rustled the reeds by the riverbank, she sometimes stood and listened not for answers, but for peace. Rita had lost so much, but she had found herself in the rubble. And now, brick by brick, heart by heart, she was building something that would outlive pain. Kamsi had not died in vain. He had become a beginning. The sky is soft with the pale gold of early morning as Rita stands once more by the river's edge. Barefoot in the damp earth, a single white hibiscus cradled in her hand. The air is still, but full of presence. Hush of water against stone, the quiet rustle of trees along the bank. She kneels slowly, reverently, lowering herself to the ground as though returning to something sacred. The river had once taken everything from her, or so it seemed. Now it bore witness to what she had reclaimed. Her fingers brushed the surface of the water, trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the enormity of what she carries and what she's learned to let go of. The flower floats just above the rippling current, still cradled in her palm. Her voice breaks the silence not aloud, but inside, steady and calm, carried by memory and wind. Asterisk, asterisk, they said grief would make me mad, but grief taught me to fight. For Kamsi, for every woman told to keep quiet. Asterisk, asterisk, her hand opens, the flower drops into the water. For a brief moment, it rests still, weightless, then begins to move with the current, not drowning, not resisting, just flowing, drifting toward the unknown, toward whatever comes next. Rita watches it until it disappears around a bend, swallowed by sunlight and trees. She stands slowly, wraps her arms around herself, not in pain, but in peace, and breathes in deep. Behind her, far off in the distance, the soft hum of life stirs at Kamsi's haven. Laughter, footsteps, the clink of tin cups. Healing has taken root, not just for her, but for many. Rita turns away from the river not with sorrow, but with quiet strength, and walks forward. The story isn't over. It has just begun.